Hi everyone, it's Sandra and this is Cinderella, my kitchen worm bin that gets everything we sweep off the floor, plus a lot of other unusual bedding. I'm going to show you some back-to-back feedings, 12 days apart, so you can see what Cinderella's worms did with the challenge I set for them in this first feeding. Because Cinderella's worms ate their burlap blanket recently, I've given them one of my cotton t-shirts. It has some polyester lace on it, but looking forward to see what the worms will do with it. I recently harvested Cinderella, which is why the bedding is so shallow. And when I filled her back up, I gave her probably about 3 dozen prawn shells. There's Landon's haircut. He obviously has white hair. The other bedding in here are some flower stems from my anniversary bouquet that was a couple of months ago that Cinderella's worms are still working on, and you can see those twig-like structures as I turn over the bedding here. I've also given her some, cardboard tubes and some cotton off vitamin bottles. Clearly the bedding is very wet. You can hear the smushing sounds of it against the bottom. And I'm also seeing that the bedding is really clinging to my hands, which doesn't happen when a bin is running nice and fluffy. I'm not worried about the worms living in this moist environment. They love the moisture, but I'm going to give them my Feel Better Soon bouquet that Landon gave me recently. It's a dozen red roses. Now these are browns because look at how dry and crispy they are. If I left them out on my counter, they would not rot. That's the benchmark for telling whether something's a green or a brown. So even though these are red in color, these are going into this bin as bedding to supply carbon, and I hope supply some aeration to this bin to help dry it out. Also gave Cinderella some used Kleenexes. Don't worry about it, the worms take care of them. And here's their feeding, which are just some collard stems, some turnip peels, some dry papery onion peel, and lots of eggshell powder. Note, I'm feeding right on top of that bouquet, so I'm hoping the worms will crawl all around those roses. The moisture from the food will moisten those roses to make them a little bit moist and start their decomposition. And because these stems actually have thorns on them, so I need the wet bedding to take care of them. Next up for Cinderella are some overs from the castings I pulled out of her a few weeks ago. These are just the big bits that I found when I was fluffing the castings and some of the worms that took some bait, as well as the odd cocoon that I found. Again, I fluff my castings every 3 weeks or so, and I try to return the worms into their home bin or another bin, because if I leave them in the castings, they just keep multiplying. So now I just have to take care of these thorny rose stems. Don't worry that the thorns are going to hurt the worms. I heard somebody say recently that, if there's a staple in the worm bin from paper, it will harm the worms. I don't think so. I mean, just look at nature. There's a lot of thorns are nature, and worms take care of them out there. Besides, this bin is so moist, I don't think those thorns will remain prickly for long. They're going to soften up pretty quickly. You don't want staples on tea bags and paper bags because it's not good for your garden. I think the worms will just avoid them. So at the end of feeding 1 here, before I get into feeding 2, I'm just trying to fit these rose stems into Cinderella. They're actually a bit longer than the bin, and they're so hard they don't want to bend. But, I've backed up the moist vermicompost on top of them as best I can, covered up the food with those overs from Cinderella's castings. So I think feeding 1, I'm going to close the book on this one, and we'll get on to feeding 2. As I said, this is 12 days later. I have actually sneaked a peek into this worm bin in the interim. After I just picked this worm off my cotton t-shirt here, I'll show you what I did. Although I said the worms love the moisture, and they certainly do, I am worried about a bin being this moist so early in its cycle. So what I decided to do is put these, flaps from Amazon boxes down the three sides of the worm bin, and you can see how they've wicked up some moisture from the castings. Hopefully you can also see how much the worms love them. Corrugated cardboard gets that corrugation from a cellulose product, basically a starch or a sugar. So the worms love crawling in those tunnels. They suck out all that nice juice once the cardboard gets moist. So it's both a brown and there's a little bit of sugar or at least starch in there for them to eat. You can see the tiny worms that are already all over this corrugated cardboard, and that the cardboard is starting to dissolve in less than 10 days. Obviously, once I've used cardboard in this fashion to wick out moisture, because there's so many baby worms and whatnot in those little grooves, these are going to have to be part of this bin now. I can't take them out and let them dry because certainly I'd be trapping some worms in there. Despite my efforts to try to dry this out, the worms and the vermicompost is still really sticking to my fingers. So I decide to take some action to get on top of this moisture. Despite the worms loving the little muddiness of the castings, I've decided to take some action and get this bin on the path to being dry and fluffy. I've shown this before, but what my preference is to add pulverized dry leaves. We pick up these leaves because we're in a drought condition here in Victoria before they've had a chance to get any fall rain on them. So they are just dried crisp on the tree and they fall to the ground. We put them in our Vitamix and this is what comes out. Like pulverized food, pulverized browns, the leaves, are super concentrated. So, I've probably added a couple cups of pulverized leaves here, probably representing quite a mound of leaves themselves. So if you do use a powdered form of carbon, recognize that you're adding a lot of carbon to the bin. Just like if you were to add pulverized food, it's a lot of food when it is broken down into such fine particles. Another form of powdered carbon I've used in the past is sifted arborist wood chips, sifted to like about 1/8 of an inch, and they would accomplish exactly the same thing in terms of amending the moisture to a bin instantly and making the castings much more fluffy. Besides, the worms absolutely love them. I actually did a test at one point where I worked in some powdered arborist or sifted arborist wood chips into the one end and fed in the other, and the worms stayed where the wood chips were. They love those browns. All right, speaking of browns, these are the rose stems. Look, they bend now. They're still pretty stiff, but certainly they're starting to feel the effects of that moisture. I just want to get the moist castings out from underneath. And where are the roses? The roses and the leaves have mostly gone. In that 12-day stretch, we're left with the stems though, and they will serve the bin to add some scaffolding, to add some aeration to this bin so that it's not just super condensed vermicompost, but there's actually some air pockets in the material. As I work the last of the powdered leaves in, I'm just going to tuck all these rose stems into a little corner now. They fit in the bin nicely, and that'll serve as my base for this feeding. It's pulverized food, but it's not super wet. I'm going to spread it out a little bit, but I don't need to add any more additional carbon because, I'm going to be putting the dry end of these box flaps down to continue to wick moisture, and I've worked in all those powdered leaves. So this bin got a huge carbon boost. I'm not worried about the moisture problem at all anymore. So let me know if you like to see these back-to-back feeding episodes. I'm happy to do them rather than just show you a single feeding at a time. I think you see how I problem solved here, the little bit of dampness, having the cotton t-shirt on top. I get to wipe my hands, but that's it for Cinderella this week. Have a good week, everyone, and thanks for watching.